The sweet, butter-warm air of June's bakery lived in the walls and clung to the glass display case like a promise. Vanilla, caramel, and toasted sugar braided together into something that should have been comforting. But for Lila Hart, the sweetness curdled in her mouth like a guilty secret. She stood at the counter with both hands clenched around the frayed strap of her handbag, knuckles pale, breathing like every inhale might shatter the shaky dam holding back her pride. Across from her, June Park, owner, baker, and the kind of loyal friend who wrote your name in the frosting of her life, watched her with a tenderness that made Lila's skin prickle. "What can I get for you, honey?" June asked, though she already knew. The order had been placed weeks ago, a special cake, a soccer field in buttercream green, Mason's dream. Lila swallowed. "I need to cancel Mason's cake," she whispered. Saying his name cracked something inside her, and the words fell out jagged and sharp. Canceling her son's 8th birthday cake, the one he'd sketched in a wobbly pencil drawing that still lived magneted to the fridge, felt less like a choice and more like raising a white flag in a war she'd been losing for years without admitting it. June's brows knit, then softened. "Lila," she breathed, "no. We can figure something out, a payment plan, or we can change the design, make it smaller. It doesn't have to be." "I can't, June." Lila lifted her chin an inch, enough to keep the tears from spilling. That tiny angle, brave and stubborn, was all that kept the shame from swallowing her whole. "Something came up at work. My hours, they cut me again. It's just not possible this month." She didn't say the rest. That a white envelope sat on her kitchen counter like a live wire. The power bill a thread in block letters whispering the word disconnection. She didn't mention the way she'd laid awake counting coins in her mind, making invisible bargains with the universe. Lights or cake? Which one keeps a little boy hopeful? In the corner of the bakery, a man at a tiny table watched the scene over the rim of a black coffee. He had that look some men wear. He saw how she squared her shoulders, as if bracing against a wind no one else could feel. He watched a flicker of pain ghost across her face, quickly hidden under something fiercer, resolve. Something about the shape of that quiet fight pulled up a memory he almost never touched anymore. His mother, standing in a line with a boy-sized winter coat in her arms and a checkbook she was too proud to open. He had been young and angry and helpless, and had promised himself that day that he would build a life where helplessness had no place. Lila managed a small, grateful smile for June, turned, and pushed through the door. The bell above it chimed, bright, cheerful, a tiny laugh at the worst moment, and she walked out into the cold glare of a weekday morning like a soldier coming off the field. Her old sedan coughed awake when she turned the key. She put her forehead to the steering wheel's cool plastic, counted to 5, and let exactly one tear drop. It carved a clean line down her dusty cheek. She wiped it away hard, angry at herself for letting it fall at all. She couldn't afford to unravel. Not when Mason's sneakers still had holes and his homework needed glue sticks and a joke at breakfast. She had to keep moving. Inside, Adrian stood. He moved with a quiet decisiveness that said he was used to doors opening at a glance. He approached the counter where June was still staring at the swinging door, her mouth pressed into a line of worry. "The cake she just canceled," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady, certain, the kind of voice people leaned toward without noticing they were doing it. June blinked herself back into the present. "The one for Mason? I'll take care of it," he said. June's gaze flicked to his wristwatch, to the trim of his jacket, to the way he occupied space like it knew him by name, and then back to his eyes. "That's very kind." She hesitated. "If I may, she wouldn't want charity." He lifted a hand, not to cut her off, but to set a boundary with gentleness. "It's not charity," he said. "I heard it was a soccer theme. Tell me about the boy." Hope is strange. Sometimes it walks in disguised as a stranger and sits quietly in the corner until you notice it. Minutes later, payment had melted into planning. June, who had known Mason since he was a pie-crust toddler, spoke with her hands. She talked about his obsession with the game, how he slept with the ball at his feet, how he'd drawn a field in crayon on the back of his math homework, how his coach said he had a sweet left foot and a sweeter heart. She told Adrian about Mason's best friends, about the way the kids in their rec league had started calling themselves the Maple Ridge Meteors, about the parents who were good people doing their best on fumes. Adrian's expression softened as the story unspooled. "It's not just about the cake," he said, half to himself. "We'll make the day feel big in a way he'll never forget." He pulled out his phone with the ease of a man whose devices were extensions of his will. "We're going to give this boy the best birthday of his life," he said, and when he looked up, the analytical chill in his gaze had been replaced by something unexpected, warmth flirting with wonder. "And his mother needs to know that her work is visible." He called his assistant. Logistics spun into motion, quietly, the way planets adjust their orbits. A weekend calendar packed with board prep, a working dinner with venture partners, a conference in Midtown. All of it dissolved with a few economical sentences. He closed the call and leaned in to June. "I need a favor," he said, his tone low and conspiratorial. "Call her best friend. We'll arrange everything, but on the day," he paused, "the surprise has to come from her." June's eyes went glossy. "You sure you want to do this without the spotlight?" "I don't want the credit," Adrian said simply. "I want to give her back her power." Morning came sliding through the cheap curtains in Mason's bedroom like a promise dressed as sunlight. It was the day he turned 8, a number he had been rolling around in his mouth for weeks, savoring the way it felt like a big step and a new secret handshake. He woke up and lay very still, listening. Most birthdays started with the smell of pancakes and a silly song. This year, though, he expected only the first part and maybe a tight hug. He was old enough now to translate grown-up whispers into meanings that hurt. Nothing extra. Not this time. Maybe next month. He dragged his hand along the quilt, smoothing the folds. "Be brave," he told himself in a whisper, an echo of something his mom said before every dentist appointment, every tryout. He went hunting for the pancakes. Instead, he found his mother dressed, her hair pulled back, a flicker of brightness in her eyes he hadn't seen in months. The kitchen smelled like sugar and browned butter and warm syrup, but something else pulsed under it. Electric, winged. "Happy birthday, my love," Lila said as if all the lights in the world had been turned on just for him. Her voice shook, but the smile was real. The pancake on his plate had chocolate chips for eyes and a smile crooked like his front teeth. She piled on whipped cream and strawberries, and then knelt in front of him. "Finish up," she said, tucking a napkin under his chin with the ceremonial seriousness of a coronation. "And go put on your soccer uniform, champ. I have a surprise for you." The word surprise lit up his face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't dare ruin it with doubt. He inhaled the pancakes, gave his mom a sticky kiss, and thundered down the hall to his room, his heart pumping so loud he thought he might float. The drive to the park was a silent seesaw of nerves and hope. Lila's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the bones looked like white branches under her skin. Her best friend Nora had called late the night before with a story delivered too quickly, too brightly. The parents pitched in, the coach got a deal. Don't ask too many questions, just say yes. It was too neat to be entirely true, which made it easier to accept. Lila was starving for one uncontaminated kindness, and she grasped this one with both hands. When the park came into view and the soccer field revealed itself, Mason made a sound that was half gasp, half squeak, all wonder. Green and white balloons bobbed along the fence line like a chorus. A banner arced between the goalposts in letters Mason had practiced all year in his school notebook. "Happy birthday, Mason!" The whole team was there, the Meteors, for once on time and all wearing matching shirts. Parents waved, kids hollered his name, and in the center of a long table, surrounded by pizza boxes and bowls of chips and a pile of wrapped gifts that looked like a mountain to him, sat a cake. Not just any cake, a stadium. A perfect, glossy mini-field with white-piped lines, tiny goalposts, even a little fondant version of his own number on a jersey so small, it made Lila's throat close. It was better than his drawing. It was, Mason decided, what dreams tasted like. "Mom," he breathed, How? Lila pulled him into her arms and hid her face in his hair so he wouldn't see her eyes overflow. I found a way, baby, she said, dizzy with relief and some more dangerous emotion she wouldn't name. From the edge of the field, underneath an old maple that had been shading scrimmages for 20 years, Adrian stood apart and let the scene lift and ache inside his chest at the same time. He watched Mason's joy break over him like summer. That joy did something strange to Adrian's insides. It moved him in places he had fortified so thoroughly he had forgotten they existed. He had closed acquisitions that shifted entire markets without breaking a sweat. This made his hands shake. He kept his distance. For most of the party, he was a quiet ghost. He helped the coach tie a stubborn banner knot and pretended to be someone's uncle for a few minutes. But as the crowd thinned and the kids began to tumble into that post-cake pre-nap delirium, he saw Lila standing by herself, her eyes soft on her son. He took a breath and crossed the grass the way a man crosses a fine wire, carefully, as if a wrong word might drop him 1,000 feet. I'm Adrian, he said, stopping a respectful step away. She turned, and the shock of recognition replaced gratitude with something more complicated. The man from the bakery, she said, because there was no use pretending she didn't know. In an instant, the puzzle snapped into place. The story Nora told, the banner, the brand new soccer balls lined up like soldiers in a row. The kindness she had wanted to be simple had a face. It had a price tag she couldn't see, which made it worse. I can't accept this, she said, the words trembling as they fell. She gestured at the field at the children with pizza sauce smiles. It's too much. You don't have to accept it, Adrian said softly. It's already done. He held her gaze. It's not charity, Lila. Think of it as an investment in joy. I forgot how to make those. Before she could argue or retreat, a human cannonball in grass-stained shorts launched himself between them. My mom said you're a soccer angel, Mason announced, solemn and earnest. Chocolate frosting streaked across his cheek in war paint. Thank you for the best day of my life. Mason wrapped his thin arms around Adrian's waist, the way children do when their gratitude hits them like weather. Adrian froze, his reflexes all wrong for this kind of contact. Then something older than habit overrode the stiffness. He bent, awkwardly at first, and laid his hands on the boy's back, large palms covering the small, warm span of a schoolboy. He patted, once, twice, finding a rhythm, and felt something give in his chest, a brick sliding out of a wall inside him that had stood since he was 12. He looked up over Mason's head and met Lila's eyes. The space between them hummed. The look had too much voltage to be labeled gratitude. It was something else now, messier, more dangerous, unexpected. It didn't last. Life, which never paused for long, snapped forward with a hard click a few days later, when Lila found a note in her cubby at the school library, where she worked afternoons. Please see Principal Abbott. Her stomach dropped. An old reflex she joked about sometimes and never could quite laugh at. She smoothed her shirt, took a breath like she was stepping into wind again, and went. Principal Abbott's office was an odd mix of plastic awards and dying plants. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Lila, he said, a little too bright. Thank you for coming. I have news, good news. The phrase rarely floated her way. She nodded to show she was listening. And the Anonymous Foundation has approached the school. They've created a scholarship program specifically for our support staff who want to pursue a full teaching degree. He paused to let it land. Full tuition, books, and a living stipend to help with childcare. It's comprehensive. Lila's heart knocked against her ribs. It felt like an old door being pushed open, a door she had closed quietly when Mason was born, and her life became something smaller and fiercer than she'd planned. She tasted hope and felt dizzy with it. And, Principal Abbott said, leaning forward, they've recommended someone for the very first award. You, the room tilted. She heard sound the way people hear underwater. She saw his lips moving. Words like next steps and orientation drifted by like curious fish. She nodded at the right times, but the part of her that had done math at midnight for the last 8 years began adding 2 and 2. There was only one person who could have nudged aboard to see her, Adrian. That night, sleep was a rumor. Gratitude kept colliding with a hard, proud rock inside her that wouldn't let her be remade by another person's money, even when that money had saved her from quietly drowning. She typed an email to the address June had whispered to her like a secret. She deleted it. She typed it again, gentler and sharper both. Thank you, maybe, and also, why? She hit send before she could lose her nerve. The reply arrived in minutes. He didn't disconnect, she realized, not from anything. The tone in his note was precise and cool. Ms. Hart, my foundation manages dozens of programs. I didn't create this particular scholarship. When the board presented it, I suggested your name. I invest in people who show potential. You show potential. Nothing more to it than that. It should have calmed her. It should have made the ground firm again. Instead, it left a gentle disappointment humming under her breastbone. Being reduced to a line in a portfolio, potential, was safe but sterile. She closed her eyes, and then her computer pinged again. P.S. My name is Adrian. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on improving these programs for single parents. Perhaps over coffee, as a consultant, of course. Consultant. The word landed like a rope tossed across a widening gap. It reframed everything: his attention, her discomfort, the distance between them. She could bring something to the table that wasn't gratitude. She could offer expertise that didn't have a price tag attached to her pride. I accept, she typed. The cursor blinked like a held breath. And in the quiet that followed, a treacherous thought curled up next to her hope. Was she taking the job, or giving herself permission to see him again? They met at a cafe halfway between Maple Ridge and the Manhattan skyline that made a glass blade across the horizon. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't a diner either. It was somewhere in between, with steel chairs that didn't wobble and light that made everyone look a little kinder. Adrian was there already, absorbed by something on his phone, a gray sweater softening the angles of him. Even dressed down, authority clung to him the way steam clings to coffee, inevitable, warm. Lila arrived with a spiral notebook hugged to her chest like armor. She'd filled pages with bullet points and sticky notes, with arrows and suddenly underlined words. If he was going to buy her coffee, she was going to earn every drop. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Cole," she said, and her formality made him smile in a way that reached his eyes and made her want to look away because you shouldn't stare at the sun. "Adrian," he said, gentle correction. "And thank you for coming. I'm overdue for a reality check." They were supposed to talk about a scholarship. They did, at first. She told him about childcare that cost more than some rents, about watching lectures online at midnight because that's when a house with a child inside it is finally quiet, about the guilt that eats and never feels full, the guilt of missing a class for a fever, the guilt of missing bedtime for a class, the guilt of doing both and feeling like you're failing at all three jobs: mother, student, worker. He didn't interrupt to solve her. He didn't throw jargon or money at the problem when she hadn't finished laying out the shape of it. He listened in a way that made her feel as if her life were a map, and he was learning to read it. They drifted, inevitably, into the personal. He told her about a marriage that ended with signatures and silence, and 1,000 small, cold moments that had gotten them there before the lawyers ever did. He said success had built him a fortress he couldn't see out of very well. "People stop seeing you," he murmured. "They see your balance sheet." "I know what it feels like to be invisible," she said softly, surprising herself with the admission and the sting behind it. The air between them thickened, the way summer air does before rain, and when the waitress came to clear his mug and her iced tea, both of them startled like they'd been caught drawing in the margins of something serious. "Your perspective is invaluable," Adrian said finally, and his voice had that professional polish again, but his eyes were telling a different story entirely. "We should continue this. Dinner? As part of your ongoing consultancy." Dinner sounded like a step. It sounded like moving from a brightly lit room into one where everything smelled like candle wax. The word consultant was still a shield, but it suddenly felt flimsy. "I don't know, Adrian," she began, and her phone vibrated against the tabletop. Mason's school glared at her from the screen. Fear lit her nerves up like a fuse. She answered with a breathless hello. The nurse was calm, professional. Mason fell at recess. He's okay, but he cut his chin. He needs stitches. The cafe blurred. Her hearing tunneled. She felt her pulse in her throat. Adrian stood before she could think to ask. He reached into his pocket, dropped cash on the table without looking at it. "I'll take you," he said, already moving, his voice leaving no room for protest. They threaded through tables and chairs and out into a day that suddenly had no temperature. Hospitals are designed to flatten hope into waiting. Beige walls, beige chairs that squeak when you shift, clocks that somehow tick louder when you're staring at them. Lila sat in that air and vibrated apart and back together again with every minute. Adrian sat beside her, not touching, not talking, just there. He brought her a cup of water and steadied it when her fingers shook. He didn't say everything will be fine because he knew words like that roll off people in rooms like this. He seemed to know she didn't need fixing. She needed a witness. When the double doors opened and Mason reappeared, pale as printer paper with a thick white bandage on his chin, Lila's heart cracked, because his eyes looked too big in his face and too young. "Mommy?" he whimpered. She stood, arms out, ready to gather him. He swerved. He ran into Adrian like a wave into rock. "Mr. Adrian," he sobbed into the soft knit of the man's sweater. It hurt so much. Adrian froze for a heartbeat, then went to his knees, dropping his height until his face was level with the boy's. He stroked Mason's hair with a hand that belonged on a boardroom table and whispered in a voice he didn't know he had, "I know, champ. I know. But you were brave. Braver than anyone in this whole building." He navigated the rest of the mess, insurance papers that might as well be hieroglyphs, a nurse with a popsicle that worked like a charm, a discharge checklist that made sense in his hands. Lila sat and held her son's sticky fingers and felt something warm and terrifying wrap around the frozen piece of her that had been guarding her heart. It was relief shaped like gratitude, shaped like something else, and she didn't know what to do with it. They were waiting on one last signature when a familiar voice oiled through the waiting room doorway. "Heard there was some drama, Eric." He still had the smile that had once made Lila believe in rescue. He wore it like a mask. He bypassed Adrian completely and went straight to Lila and Mason, crouching so his face was theatrical concern. "Elle," he said softly, like he had the right to nickname her. "You look wiped." "Let me take it from here. I'll bring him back later. You rest." Smith, smiling at her, he patted Mason's knee, but the words were for Lila, soothing, controlling, the same old song. He had always been best in the post-crisis photo, lousy in the actual fire. The air changed. It thickened with something primal. Adrian stood, a quiet wall. Eric climbed to his full height and finally looked at him. "And you are?" he asked, as if reading a name tag that wasn't there. "Adrian Cole," Adrian said. He extended a hand and didn't blink. "Friend of the family." The way he said family had architecture and steel behind it. He wasn't asking permission. He was placing himself like a pillar. Eric's smile flickered. He clocked the watch, the quiet power, and deflated a fraction. Lila stood between them for a moment, feeling like a person caught between a past that took and a future that might demand. She had worn down her edges for years, keeping the peace for Mason, smoothing the roughness of Eric's selfishness because conflict in front of a child felt like a failure. But something in her had shifted over the last week. It was the image of Adrian's palm on her son's back and the way he had said friend of the family like armor. "We're going with Adrian," she said. The words came out calm, clean, shocking even to herself. She picked up Mason's small, warm hand and didn't look back. In the car, Mason slept almost immediately, exhausted, his head rolling against the leather seat like a marble. The quiet between the adults was musical with a new tension that wasn't uncomfortable, just alive. Streetlights slid past in amber stripes. "Thank you," Lila said eventually, almost to the windshield. "Back there." "He has a way of making you feel small," Adrian said. Not as a question, but an informed note. "Yes," she whispered. and the relief of being understood nearly took her breath away. At her apartment building, he didn't idle at the curb. He turned off the engine, got out, and met her in the back seat. He unbuckled a drowsy Mason with a gentleness that made Lila's eyes burn, then lifted the boy like it was easy. He carried Mason up 3 flights without breathing hard, like a man who had trained for a different kind of endurance and was relieved to find it useful for once. Lila tucked Mason into bed under his superhero comforter, kissed his forehead where a vein pulsed like a tiny blue river, and came out to find Adrian standing in her small living room by a bookshelf of mismatched frames. He had a photo in his hand. It was Lila in a cap and gown, freshly 18, cheeks still chubby with youth, eyes lit by a clean flame of belief. She was holding a diploma like a sword. "You look happy," he said. "I was," she answered, and didn't add, before I dropped out for a ring and a promise that turned into a bruise you couldn't see. She stood beside him, close enough to smell soap and cedar, and something she would later recognize as cinnamon bloom cologne. That was before Eric and I thought the future would be easier if we jumped to the end. Before I gave up on me. He turned, and something shifted in his mouth. Tenderness reigned in. "It's not too late to find yourself again." The distance between them shrank until it was an inch. The air hung heavy, charged, vibrating with all the things they hadn't said. He tilted his head. She couldn't help it. Her eyes dropped to his mouth. Her breath caught. He leaned forward. His phone rang. The sound was too loud for the room, jangling. He flinched, fished it out, checked the screen, and his jaw tightened. "Mom, now?" he muttered as he turned away. "Now is not a good time." A pause. "No, she's not another one of my charity projects. Please, don't get involved." He ended the call too quickly. He turned back, apology already written on his face, but the magic had scattered like startled birds. "Sorry," he said, voice rough. "Vivian can be intrusive." Lila didn't hear the apology. All she heard was the phrase that had detonated something in her chest. Charity project. It rattled around her ribcage, ricocheting, finding every soft place and scraping it raw. "Does she think I'm a charity project?" she asked in a voice that sounded like a colder version of itself. The vulnerable girl from moments ago had been replaced by a woman with armor. He scrubbed a hand through his hair, leaving it disheveled, looking for a foothold. "No, of course not," he said too fast. And even he seemed to hear the weakness in the denial. "She only knows my pattern. I fix. Or I try. It's a flaw." "A flaw?" Lila laughed without humor. "Seems more like a hobby." The dam inside her cracked. "I don't need saving. I needed a chance. You gave it to me, and I'll be grateful forever. But I am not a broken toy for you to repair, Adrian. I am not a project you can manage." "That's not what this is," he snapped. Defensive now. Heat lighting his own nerves. "I was trying to control everything," she shot back. "The party, the scholarship, the hospital. You sweep in and take over until there's no room left for my own pride to breathe." There are fights where both people are wrong and right in equal measure, and the truth gets pinched between them. This was one of those. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was ugly in a quiet way, fueled by old bruises neither of them had caused, and the fresh sting of a misused word. "I should go," he said finally, and the click of her door closing behind him sounded gentler than it felt. The next day, the library was a monastery of silence that didn't soothe Lila. The guilt replayed in her head. She checked in returns, straightened shelves, smiled mechanically at students. Around noon, the door opened and a woman walked in who immediately rearranged the molecules of the room. She was elegant the way old money is elegant, quietly, with pearls and a tailored blazer and silver hair that had more style than most 20-somethings. She crossed to the desk with a measured step, the kind you learn if you spend years making entrances. "You must be Lila," she said, voice smooth like glass. "I'm Vivian Cole, Adrian's mother." The bottom dropped out of Lila's stomach. She braced herself for the speech about knowing her place, the speech that lives like folklore in small towns. Instead, Vivian's expression softened around the edges. "My son," she said, without preamble, "is brilliant with numbers, and a catastrophe with feelings. particularly when it comes to people he cares about. I'm here to apologize for my comment you overheard. It was clumsy and unfair. Lila blinked. The script had been switched without her permission. Vivian gestured toward the cafe across the street with a small tilt of her head. Will you indulge me for 10 minutes? I'd like to speak to you properly. They sat at a small table with Earl Grey steaming in delicate cups and a scone that Vivian broke open with nimble fingers, offering half like a peace offering. Vivian told Lila about a boy who had grown up too fast because the world demanded it, about a marriage that had cut him and the way he had bandaged the wound by throwing money at problems until they went quiet. He thinks money is a language everyone understands, she said, rueful and fond at once. He's trying not to fix you, my dear. He's trying to fix himself through you. It was a perspective Lila didn't know she needed until she heard it. And then Vivian landed the final blow without altering her tone. He canceled a trip to Tokyo this week, she said casually. $1 billion negotiation. He told his board he had an urgent consultancy in Maple Ridge. $1 billion. Lila sat very still, the cafe noise lowering like someone had put a blanket over it. He had walked away from that for a single afternoon coffee with her. The very trait she'd cursed as control, it was proof, she realized with searing clarity, of something closer to devotion. Ground that had been shifting beneath her steadied. She left the cafe with a small scone in a napkin, and a larger, softer understanding. She didn't have the same tools he had, but she had her own. She dialed his number before the courage evaporated. "Adrian," she said when his guarded hello came through, voice carefully neutral. "Do you still require my consultancy services?" A beat. "I do," he replied, and she could hear his caution melting into curiosity. "Good," she said, and smiled because this was something she could do. "I have an assignment. Saturday, my place. Wear clothes you're not afraid to ruin." On Saturday, he knocked at her door wearing jeans that cost more than her rent and a brand new work shirt still stiff from the store. He looked confused and willing, a combination that was dangerously charming. Lila, with Mason at her side, led them to the community park, the same field that had held balloons a week ago and still held, faintly, the sound of laughter. She guided them past the slides and the swings to the far field the kids used for soccer. The grass was patchy, the lines faded to ghosts, the goalposts rusting at their roots. A delivery had left rolls of turf like oversized carpets in the morning shade. She handed him a rake. "Today," she said, eyes bright with something like challenge, "you're not a CEO, and I'm not a scholarship recipient. We're just two parents fixing a field." For a heartbeat, he looked at the rake like it was a relic from another planet. He glanced at Mason, already on his knees unrolling sod with the ferocity of a prospector, then back at Lila. And he smiled, slow and real, a boy cracking through the man. He was terrible at first, like a person learning a dance with the wrong song playing. But Adrian learned quickly. He was laughing out loud by the third roll, dirt streaking his face like war paint. He and Mason fell into a friendly competition that had Lila laughing too, the kind that shaves years off your shoulders. For hours, under a forgiving sky and a sun that seemed to bless the whole enterprise, he wasn't the man from the glass tower. He was just a man with dirty hands laying down squares of possibility, with people he was beginning to understand he could belong to. At the end of the afternoon, they collapsed on the new grass and ate sandwiches Lila had packed in zip-top bags that she handed out like communion. Lemonade disappeared. Shoulders brushed. Silence settled. The good kind. "This," Adrian sighed, looking up at the carelessly blue sky, "is the best board meeting I've had in a year." That's when the sleek black convertible glided into the parking lot and cut the quiet in half. The woman who stepped out turned heads the way flashbulbs turn. She wore a white dress like it had been hung on her body by a stylist, and the sun existed to make her glow. Her expression was beautiful and cold. "Adrian," she snapped, voice sharp enough to cut a ribbon, "I've called all afternoon. We had the Midtown Hospital gala. You were the guest of honor." Sloan, his ex-wife. Her gaze swept over the field with something like disdain and stopped on Lila and Mason. "So this is where you've been? Playing house with the locals?" She laughed. It was ugly. Pathetic. Adrian was on his feet instantly, stepping slightly in front of Lila and Mason without making a show of it. His face went granite. "Go home, Sloane." "Oh, I will," she said sweetly, "after I make sure your new pet project knows exactly what she's signing up for." She turned her venom on Lila. "Ask him about the prenup, sweetheart. Ask him what happens to his little distractions when he gets bored." The poison hung in the air long after the convertible purred away. Lila felt it seeping under her skin. She looked at Adrian. What did she mean? He raked his fingers through his hair and left a streak of dirt across the expensive mess of it. "The prenuptial agreement was complicated," he said. "I was protecting the company. The people on my payroll, my investors. She's twisting it, that's what she does." He explained the clauses and the contingencies and the hostile takeover rumors and words that sounded to Lila like a language designed to put feelings in tiny boxes and lock them. It made sense, logically, but logic doesn't hold hands with love very well. A chill slid into her bones that had nothing to do with shade. Doubt seeded itself. It doesn't take much. She retreated in the days that followed, not dramatically, just by inches, so small you could mistake them for breaths. She focused on textbooks and quizzes and lesson plans. She returned his calls with polite brevity and perfect excuses. She told herself she was protecting Mason, herself, even him. Eric, smelling opportunity the way sharks smell blood, reappeared in soft clothes and softer words. He asked to talk about Mason, to get on the same page, to be reasonable. He picked a small Italian place downtown, red checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in old wine bottles. A place where the past could pretend to be charming. For one dinner, he was the man she used to love, attentive, funny, asking about her classes with something like pride. She relaxed a degree. The check came. He reached across the table, fingers hovering over hers. "I miss this," he said, and for a second she felt the old ache where the blind hope used to live. The door opened. The bell above it chimed like fate. Adrian stood there with a single red rose, looking out of place and sweetly human. He saw her. He saw Eric. He saw the almost touch. The small, foolish hope on his face broke like thin ice. He hardened instantly. He turned and left, and the air whooshed out of Lila's lungs like she'd been punched. She knocked a water glass over. "I have to go," she stammered, and didn't wait for Eric's confusion. She ran outside, into a street that had emptied as if the city itself had conspired against her. Adrian's car was gone, a sleek shadow already swallowed by the dark. She called. It rang and rang and rang. Voicemail. She texted. It remained unread. She texted again. It felt like tapping on a wall. The panic that rose in her wasn't about losing a benefactor. It wasn't about money. It was about losing him. And the realization docked in her like a ship that had been circling one harbor its whole life without admitting it needed to anchor. She loved him. 2 days dragged by in a silence that made soundless days heavy. She went through motions like a ghost. On the third morning, she was waiting for the coffee maker to cough itself awake and scrolling mechanically through news when a headline slapped her fully into her body. Coal Dynamics stock nosedives as rival launches surprise product. She clicked with a finger that had gone numb. The article was a parade of panic. A young wolf competitor had released a new platform that threatened to make Coal's flagship technology look like yesterday's phone. The market was in free fall, and his name, Adrian, was in every paragraph, described in war terms, bunker, triage, strategy. He was, the piece said, locked in his Manhattan headquarters with his top team, living on coffee and calculation. She put her phone down and everything rearranged. His silence wasn't about pride or embarrassment. It was about survival. While she had been spiraling around a scene in a restaurant, his kingdom had been set on fire. Fear hit her, but for him this time, not herself. She didn't call. He wouldn't answer. She grabbed her keys and a brown paper bag and drove to Manhattan without telling anyone, because sometimes you can feel the shape of the right action without knowing its name. Coal Dynamics headquarters was a cathedral of steel, made to make people feel small. Lila walked into the cavernous lobby in jeans and a jacket she'd bought at a thrift store when money was a rumor. The receptionist glanced up in a way Lila had seen before, bored, then dismissive. "Mr. Cole isn't seeing visitors. Please tell him his consultant from Maple Ridge is here," Lila said. Calm she didn't feel. "And tell him it's an emergency." The word emergency rearranged the receptionist's face. She touched her headset, listened, then gave Lila a look that was one part apology, one part surprise, and waved her through security. The executive floor felt like a war room that had lost patience for niceties. People moved fast and whispered updates. Through a glass wall at the end of the corridor, she saw Adrian with his sleeves rolled and jaw rough and eyes too bright. He directed the chaos like a conductor. He glanced up, saw her, and on his face something breakable flashed before anger took its place like armor. He left the room, shutting the door with a soft precision that told her he was holding himself together by force. "What are you doing here?" he asked, low and harsh enough to burn. "I don't have time for this," he added. It should have sent her away. It didn't. She saw the fear underneath, old and new, bone deep. She lifted the paper bag she'd brought like it mattered more than dignity. "You have time to eat," she said, "and 5 minutes to breathe." He stared at the bag as if it were an alien object. She took a step closer. "We will talk about the other night," she promised, quietly. "But right now you have a company to save. I'll be in your office. When you're done, I'll still be here." She held his gaze. "I'm not a distraction, Adrian. I'm your harbor." She slipped past him, a small human breeze in a building of storms, and made her way to his office, which was big and intimidating, and suddenly also deeply human because she was in it. He stood in the hall for a moment, looking at the bag in his hand like it had gravity. Then he squared his shoulders and walked back into the conference room, and something essential in him had shifted from frantic to focused. He stopped reacting and began leading again. The night was a mess of coffee and whiteboards and ugly truths, and the spark of a risk that might just pay off if executed with precision and a little reckless belief. Dawn looked like forgiveness through the Manhattan windows when he walked back to his office and found it dark and soft and blessedly quiet. Lila was on the sofa, asleep under her jacket, her hands tucked under her cheek like a child. He stood in the doorway and felt a tenderness rise in him so intense it made him sit to keep from falling. He had collected rare whiskey and rare art and rare deals. He had never had this, someone who walked into the eye of his storm and fell asleep because they trusted he'd come back. He found a cashmere throw in a closet, a ridiculous thing to have in an office, and laid it over her like a benediction, brushing a loose strand of hair away with a touch that made his chest ache. Then he sat across from her and watched her breathe until the sun drew a line across the floor. When she stirred, she blinked toward him, and the smile that dawned was soft and private. "Hi," she murmured. "Hi," he answered, and felt the rest of the world recede a step. They talked. She explained dinner with Eric as a co-parenting truce that had gone sideways at the exact wrong moment. He admitted the slice of his heart that had gone cold in that restaurant wasn't about betrayal. It was about an old fear he'd never said out loud. What if what he was, complicated, public, heavy, wasn't what she wanted when a simpler life sat right across from her in worn flannel? She reached for words to tell him how wrong he was, how she'd realized in the alley next to a restaurant that she loved him, even if she hadn't said it yet, when his phone buzzed on the desk like an angry bee. Vivian's name glowed. He went to answer. A text popped up instead. "Turn on the news, now." He grabbed the remote and clicked on the monitor on the wall. A glossy talk show filled the screen. Sloane sat in a chair with crossed legs and a face arranged in concern. "And sources inside the company are deeply worried," she was saying, "that Mr. Cole's emotional instability, fueled by his new obsession, has become the real problem at Cole Dynamics." She didn't say Lila's name. She didn't have to. The insinuation was as sharp as her cheekbones. "She's going to destroy me," Adrian said. And the words weren't about money. "Turn it off," Lila said. And when he didn't, she crossed to the console and did it herself. The screen went mercifully black. His phone lit up with calls from his PR team. He stared at the stack of crisis playbooks in his brain and looked exhausted in a way that made Lila's protective instincts roar to the surface. "You can't fight her poison with more poison," she said, still standing in front of him, anchoring him. "Tell the truth. Not the market truth. Your truth." He nodded, slowly at first, then with the decisiveness she'd seen when he made a call in a boardroom. He picked up his phone, told his head of comms to cancel the controlled press release, and scheduled a live press conference for the next morning. He walked onto a stage bristling with microphones and cameras, and looked like a man who had been awake for years and was suddenly very awake in a different way. Lila watched on his office monitor, her heartbeat keeping time with the hum of the building. He didn't deny, he didn't deflect. He started with accuracy. "I made mistakes," he said into the thrum. He talked about missing people while building a monument to his ambition. He acknowledged the blind spot the competitor had exploited and laid out an aggressive, unflinching plan to pivot and build better. And then he did something that made Lila put a hand over her mouth. "My ex-wife mentioned a distraction," he said. "Let me tell you about her." His voice softened and he looked not at the room but at the camera, as if it contained a single person. "She is a single mother who works harder than anyone I know. She is putting herself through school at night so her son will see her become who she always could have been. She reminded me that people aren't numbers to be analyzed. They are lives to be honored." He exhaled. "She is the most important thing in my life. If loving her disqualifies me in some eyes, then those aren't eyes I will be led by." The room murmured. The news cycle halted and blinked, and then pivoted, hungry as always, but this time toward a story with a heart beating inside it. Lila felt pride and panic tangle up and wrestle. He had just put them under a spotlight she'd never wanted. The world would have questions. They'd answer them together, she told herself. And the together part was the first thing that mattered. The public response was immediate and messy, and for once mostly kind. Coal dynamics stabilized, the stock's fall slowed. The paler wave of opinion turned, then swelled. The narrative of a distracted CEO replaced by the story of a man who'd remembered he had a heart and backbone both. Lila's life, however, contracted and expanded painfully overnight. Paparazzi started haunting Maple Ridge the way crows do when there's something shiny. Headlines boiled over with phrases like waitress and billionaire and Cinderella, and Lila found herself refusing to disappear. "No," she told Adrian, gently, in her small living room with the blinds drawn against long lenses when he offered compounds and security like bandages. "If this is going to be real, we have to live it in my world, too. I won't vanish into yours." She wore a hoodie to class and held her head up at the library. She took Mason to the park and ignored the cliques. She stayed visible because being visible on her terms was the only way to win a game she hadn't asked to play. The town watched, and something like respect replaced the prurient spark. People brought cookies. They offered smiles instead of questions. Adrian learned new habits. He started showing up in Maple Ridge as if it were as normal as Midtown. He bought coffee at June's and tipped like a gentleman. He pushed Mason in a grocery cart until the boy shrieked with delight. And he clapped too loudly at rec league games until other parents elbowed him and grinned. He wasn't hiding a billionaire. He was becoming someone's neighbor. One afternoon, he drove them to the edge of town and parked in front of a lot choked with weeds and stubborn hope. "I bought this," he said with his hands in his pockets. Suddenly uncertain, a rare sight. Lila braced herself for a mansion she couldn't live in. He shook his head. "Not for us." He looked at her, and she recognized the solemn look that meant a piece of his heart was about to show. "For the town. The Cole Foundation is building a community center here, a new library, proper fields, after-school tutoring, adult education. This place should feel like possibility when you walk past it." He took a breath. "I want you on the board," he said, "to guide it. Shape it, name it if you want. I don't want to gift you security. I want to hand you the microphone." Words failed her for a moment, and then tears didn't. They weren't heavy, sad ones. They were light, effervescent, proof that joy is a physical thing. He reached for her hand and held it like he understood what it meant to let a person write their name into the foundation of something that would outlast them. "I have one more question," he said, turning to Mason, who had been plinking a rock with his sneaker and pretending not to listen. "Champ, come here." Mason jogged over, solemn. Adrian knelt until the dust stained his knee. "I love your mom," he said, and he didn't look away from the boy when he said it. "And I love you. I want to be in this family for the long haul. Would you give me permission to ask her to marry me?" Mason's face cracked into the kind of grin that makes adults believe in God. He threw his arms around Adrian's neck and yelled into his ear, "I thought you'd never ask." Still holding Mason's hand, Adrian turned to Lila and bent one knee to ground. He opened a small velvet box. The ring wasn't a billboard. It was simple. It was elegant. It was a promise made visible. He didn't say, "Will you?" because he didn't need to. His eyes said everything. 1 year later, June's bakery smelled the way it always had, like sugar and shelter. But the taste in Lila's mouth was all honey. She was there to pick up a cake the size of a small car, its frosting a perfect miniature stadium with details so precise she wanted to take a picture before cutting it. June and one of the teens who worked the counter wrestled it into a box with a grin and a groan. Adrian stood behind Lila, his palm warm at the small of her back, an anchor she leaned into without thinking. A ring flashed on Lila's finger when the light hit it right, a quiet sparkle. June watched them go with joy pooling in her eyes. "Full circle, huh?" she murmured to no one as the door shut and the bell chimed their exit like a song. The party wasn't at the old park. It was at the brand new Maple Ridge Community Center, a glassy, joyful building perched on the bones of the empty lot. Kids ran feral and free across fields that Lila knew down to the sod rolls underneath. The library inside had squeaky new chairs and sun that poured through the windows like it was happy to be home. The town showed up for Mason's 9th birthday because it felt like their celebration too. They had watched this family fall apart and then knit themselves into something that looked like a promise and progress all at once. Lila's mom, who felt like herself again after a winter of getting strong, ladled punch next to Vivian Cole, who wore flats and a cardigan instead of pearls and looked oddly at home doing anything useful with her hands. They laughed together like women who had decided to stop caring about the century they belonged to. Across the lawn, Eric stood and talked to another dad, doing something he had never managed well, occupying an appropriate amount of space. He had learned a new role. He liked it. Mason tore through gifts like an excavator, his friends chanting his name in a rhythm that turned the air fizzy. Adrian pulled Lila away for a moment and stood with her at the entrance, where they could see everything they had built and everything that had built them. "Happy birthday to him," she said. "Happy anniversary to us," he corrected. "This is the day it all really started." He tilted her chin up with a single finger and kissed her like home. Slow, sure, no question marks. Mason raced toward them, holding a paper in both hands like a flag. "Look," he said, breathless. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a square building with big windows. The figures had smiley faces so wide they looked slightly ridiculous and perfect. Above them, in blocky handwriting that still tripped on its own letters, he had written 5 words: "Best birthday in the world today." Lila looked from the drawing to Adrian and felt tears gather and fall without pain. He pulled her in snug. The story that had started in a bakery with a canceled cake and a woman trying not to break had grown into something the size of a town and the shape of love. It had grown on a foundation of small, stubborn choices: to show up, to listen, to tell the truth, to let each other be seen fully. And that was the breakthrough that mattered most, that in the glare and the mess and the sweetness, they hadn't become beneficiaries and benefactors or problems and solutions. They had become a family.